The submarine designated as U-977 was a Type VIIc U-boat. The Type VIIc U-boat was the follow-up to the shorter Type 7B. It was powered by two 4-stroke, 6-cylinder supercharged diesel engines while surfaced. When submerged, it was powered by two double-acting electric motors. U-977 could hold a crew of between 44 and 60 men. Worth noting is that U-977 entered into service relatively late in the war. That is why it was only launched on March 31, 1943, and commissioned on May 6, nearly 4 years after the Second World War commenced. The sub attained serious damage to its pressure hull during training exercises, and so was only used as a training vessel. Schäffer took over command of U-977 in mid-December 1944, as it continued in its role as a so-called schoolboat. Oberleutnant zur See Heinz Schäffer was born in Berlin on April 28, 1921, and had been fascinated with boats since he was a young boy. Schäffer joined the Kriegsmarine just before World War II broke out and soon joined the U-boat division. He served as first watch officer on U-445 for 4 patrols during the early years of the war. He was just 24 years of age when he took command of U-977. U-977 finally left for its first patrol on April 16, 1945, making its way past Frederikshavn in Denmark, heading for Horten in Norway. At that time, both Scandinavian countries were still under what were the dying days of Nazi occupation. After a few hours in Oslo Fjord, it then made its way to Kristiansand, to the southwest of Oslo, on April 30, 1945. Its principal mission during its first patrol was to lurk in the waters of the English Channel, ostensibly to blow up vessels in Southampton Harbor. That never came to pass. Instead, the crew of U-977 would celebrate May Day on May 1st, as well as hold a flag ceremony in honor of Adolf Hitler's death. Yes, Hitler was dead, having been found dead in his Berlin bunker by Soviet forces liberating the German capital. The crew on board U-977 must surely have known that the end of the Third Reich was imminent. German surrender was officially announced on May 8th, and so proceeded lengthy discussions among the crew on board U-977. The sub was in the vicinity of Bergen, Norway's second largest city, and they debated what to do next. Finally, it was announced by Schäffer that U-977 would not be surrendering. He gave married crew members the option to leave so that they could rejoin their families in Germany. Those that remained would escape with Schäffer on board U-977, and so it was that 3 enlisted men and 13 petty officers boarded 3 large rubber boats in the early hours of the morning of May 10, 1945. These married men had decided to surrender themselves after going ashore at the island of Holsenoy near Bergen, on Norway's southwestern coast. For those men who remained on board U-977 and refused to surrender, the choice of destination had been made for them by Schäffer. That place was Argentina. So why did Schäffer decide not to surrender his U-boat? Was it simply because he wanted to escape capture? Some would contend it was a last-minute act of cowardice and self-preservation by Schäffer and his men. However, according to the man himself, he decided not to surrender because of the words of Germany's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. According to Schäffer, Goebbels had proclaimed that the Allies had their so-called Morgenthau Plan, in which they were hell-bent on leveling Germany. The plan included enslaving and sterilizing all German men, according to Goebbels. Schäffer and his crew believed what Goebbels proclaimed. The men were also reminded of how poorly German POWs had been treated in the aftermath of the First World War. They simply didn't want to suffer the same fate. There's more that could explain the decision not to surrender. In a statement he would make when interrogated by the Allies, Schäffer had this to say: "When we began our patrol, an official slogan had been posted on all naval establishments and ships which said, 'The enemy shall find in Germany nothing but rats and mice. We will never capitulate. Better death than slavery.'" He would add, "I no longer considered my ship as a man of war, but as a means of escape, and I tried to act for the best interests of all aboard." Why Argentina? Schäffer also admitted that he made the escape on U-977 in order to secure better living conditions for he and his men in Argentina. At that time, it was well known that Argentina had a large German community. It was a highly patriotic community that would not hesitate to help other Germans in need. Not only was the German community in Argentina a large one, it was also mostly very pro-Nazi. This is well documented, and explains how Argentina, like Paraguay, became a safe haven for so many German officers and Nazi escapees after World War II. In fact, Nazi influence in Argentina went far beyond rescuing Nazis after the war. The German community funded right-wing politicians and causes in Argentina throughout the 1950s and 60s. It was support that would culminate in the murderous ultra-right-wing military dictatorship or junta that ruled the country by terror in the mid-1970s to early 1980s. Argentina's history is steeped in fascism backed by its ultra-conservative German community, dating back to the times when the likes of Schäffer arrived on its shores. The irony is that the German community didn't get to help out Schäffer and his men, but more on that a little later. One needs to remember that U-977 was severely undermanned as it made its way down to South America. Conditions on board were awful, and it was later reported that many of the crewmen were on the verge of nervous breakdowns. As for the voyage itself, U-977 made her way for the Iceland Passage, thereafter passing about 100 miles to the west of the Madeira Islands. Schäffer would confirm that the submarine stopped in the Portuguese colony of the Cape Verde Islands off Western Africa for a short break on July 14, 1945, or what was termed a swim break. The sub crossed the equator on July 23rd and finally arrived in Mar del Plata in Argentina on August 17th. This equated to a voyage totaling 8,797 miles or 14,157 kilometers in distance and 107 days at sea. 66 of those days were spent completely submerged. It was the second longest time that any U-boat had ever spent continuously underwater. There are other interesting stats attached to this voyage. For example, U-977 had left Bergen with 85 metric tons of fuel on board and had about 5 tons left when it arrived in Mar del Plata. That can only mean that U-977 had traveled at an extremely slow average speed. That surely would have made the journey even more tortuous for those on board. Also worth noting is that Schäffer did find out on July 30th that another U-boat, U-530, had already arrived in Argentina and been handed over to the Americans, and yet that didn't deter him one iota in continuing straight for Argentina. The man and his crew were on a mission to reach South America. Upon arrival, the crew of U-977 surrendered to the Argentinian authorities only to be extradited to the United States. The Argentinians had treated the Germans well, but had no choice but to give them up to American demands. It was reported that U-977 was in good working condition when the Americans took charge of it. In fact, only minor mechanical defects were noted by the engineering officer who inspected the German submarine. These included a damaged periscope, a damaged Junkers air compressor, a damaged supercharger, a stuck connection in the starboard diesel engine, and a defective pressure oil pump motor. Otherwise, U-977 was in very good condition. The submarine itself was transferred from Rio Santiago Naval Base in Buenos Aires, Argentina, under escort by USS Cherokee, arriving in New London, Connecticut on October 12, 1945. Importantly, 10 torpedoes found on board were still intact. That number would play an important part in the American interrogation of Schäffer and his men. In short, the Americans accused the crew of U-977 of having blown up the Brazilian cruiser Bahia. The American charges were based on the fact that U-977 had arrived with 10 torpedoes on board and not the usual 14, and that the 4 missing tubes were on the front side. According to the Americans, this would more than account for the sinking of the Bahia. The Germans emphatically denied the charges, stating that they only had 10 torpedoes on board because munitions were in very short supply by the end of the war. The crew knew that Germany was losing, and it manifested itself in everything from less torpedoes to a lack of spare parts and even food on board. Schäffer himself, as commander of U-977, was being threatened with the death penalty because of these accusations. Thankfully for him, the Brazilian Minister for Shipping intervened when it was proven that U-977 was nowhere near the Bahia at the time of the Brazilian ship's sinking. In fact, it would later turn out that the Brazilian cruiser sank because of its own ammunition exploding by mistake. The crew were then extradited to Britain, where they now accused of having used their submarine to smuggle Nazi leaders in Argentina, including Adolf Hitler himself. That too was of course hotly denied by Schäffer and his crew. The British were suspicious of this because of the date that U-977 left Bergen, almost to the day of Hitler's suicide. It was still 1945, and many allies were not convinced that Hitler was dead. On the contrary, the British accused Schäffer and his crew of evacuating Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun. It was then alleged that Hitler escaped to Patagonia, a vast, sparsely populated region in southern Argentina. It got even more fantastical. From there, it would be contended by some, the Führer may have even made his way to a secret fortress in Antarctica of all places. This place would be called Neuschwabenland, or Neuberchtesgaden. The allegations did prove impossible to prove. Schäffer would finally be released from British prison in 1947. Interestingly, he returned to live in Argentina in 1950. He would go on to write the book titled U-97766 Tage unter Wasser, or U-97766 Days Underwater, as published in 1952. 6 decades later, his granddaughter, Nadine Poulain, would direct both a documentary and art film based on her grandfather's book, both of which were released in 2014. When interviewed, Poulain would say that her films were a homage to what she believed was the bravery and self-determination of the crew of U-977. The accusations against the so-called clandestine mission of U-977 have continued to the present day. Besides allowing Hitler to escape, it has been alleged that the sub was used to smuggle tons of gold out of Europe, and even that it made a secret diversion to Antarctica along the way. Schäffer denied all these allegations until the very day he died in 1979. As for U-977, it was used and sunk as target practice in 1946 during naval exercises by the U.S. Navy. It was the exact same ignominious fate that awaited U-530, the other sub that escaped to Argentina. The surrender of Germany was the capitulation that few would have initially believed possible. After all, just a few years earlier, the Nazi takeover of all Europe seemed almost inevitable. One country after another had fallen to the might of the Third Reich. And yet on May 8, 1945, it was indeed all over.